Hello everyone, this is Aaron Ensley, and today what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through how to graph a tariff. We're going to start looking at the U.S. market for motorcycles, assuming that they're at the free trade, or they're trading and importing from the rest of the world initially. We certainly could start at the autarky price and at the autarky quantity, meaning that there was no trade in that situation, but it adds some complication. And so what I want to do is I want to assume that they're already engaged in free trade, and that in this case they're buying at the world price. So PW is going to be the world price, and at that world price what we'll see is a quantity produced of 200, quantity produced of 200 in the United States, and a quantity consumed in the United States of 600. What does that mean? It means that initially we are importing 400 units. We're only producing 200 domestically. So these first 200 might have been produced in the United States. The latter 400 were produced elsewhere. They were imported from somewhere else. Now, it's important for us to first identify the areas of consumer and producer surplus. So when we're looking at our consumer and producer surplus, we have a very, very large consumer surplus after free trade. This entire area would actually be consumer surplus. So it's a very large consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is actually going to be A through G. So A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. The only area of producer surplus at the moment is area H. So the producers are not happy about this because they have just this tiny surplus. Maybe they used to have a bigger surplus before there was free trade, but now they only have area H. So the producers are not happy about this. So what happens? Now perhaps what occurs is the producers go to Congress and they ask for a protective tariff. They say, you know, it's not fair that they're importing motorcycles into the United States for $6,000. It's hard for us to compete with that. So what we'd like you to do, Mr. and Mrs. Congressman, is put a $1,000 tariff or tax on imported motorcycles. So what this would do is it would raise the price up by $1,000. So this would be the price in the world plus the tariff. Okay? So that would be $7,000. So price plus tariff. And at $7,000, we can see that that $7,000 price is going to intersect with the domestic supply at 300. So this is going to be our quantity produced 2. So it's an increase in domestic production. But it's going to intersect with our quantity consumed in the United States at 500. So the domestic consumption is actually going to decline from 600 to 500. So our new imports are only going to be 200 rather than the initial 400. Now, how does that affect the rest of the graph? Well, the first thing that it's going to do, it's going to make the producers happy because they are going to now have a higher price, and they're going to produce more, which means that they are going to have a producer surplus that extends all the way up to $7,000 and all the way over to the quantity of 300. So they gain area D. So the new producer surplus is going to be H and D. So the producers are very happy about this. Now the consumers are only going to have the surplus area that is above area, or above the price. So the new consumer surplus is going to be the areas that I've identified here. A, B, and C. So what happens to everything else? Well, if we have a $1,000 tariff and we are importing 200 units, that area, this box here of area F, this is going to represent the area of tariff revenue. So box F is actually going to be the tariff revenue. And so $1,000 times 200 is going to give you $200,000 that goes to the government. So the area F is going to represent the tariff revenue. Well, what about E and G? E and G become deadweight loss. Which means that these are unrealized gains, gains that we do not have. So producers and consumers are not able to engage in trade at prices or quantities that they otherwise would have liked to. Now, one sort of add-on to this is it's very obvious that this is good for producers because the producers increase their producer surplus by area D from area H to area H and D. It's bad for consumers because the consumers lose this whole strip of surplus. It's good for the government to some degree because they are, of course, getting revenue. So maybe they're happy about this. But obviously the loss to society and the deadweight loss is no good. It's also worth noting that the government could do a slightly different policy. Rather than having a tariff of $1,000, you could effectively put an import quota, which is a restriction in the number that you import that would serve the same purpose. So the way that this would work is, let's suppose they say, okay, the new imports are now 200. What I could do instead is I could put an import quota in place. And what I'd be doing then is I'd be looking for a gap in the amount of the imports I'm seeking. And that gap, in this case, would be 200. A gap between the domestic supply and the domestic demand, which was, of course, in the amount of 200. So if you wanted to have a quota would just, you would simply take the amount of the quota that you're looking for and find it wherever there's a gap between the domestic supply and the domestic demand. So a quota, again, is a legal restriction on the number that you import. It is not a tax. So what happens to area F? Area F would be additional income to foreign producers. So think of it this way. If the foreign producers were originally importing 200 units, if you were importing 200 units and you were selling them at $6,000, that would have been the revenue that would go to the foreign producers. If area F no longer goes to the government, this just gets captured by the foreign producers. So the foreign producers would now get not $6,000 per motorcycle, but $8,000 per motorcycle times the 200 motorcycles that they would be exporting to the United States, which becomes the U.S. imports. The quota area is a separate graph in theory, but I wanted to show you how it relates to doing the tariff.